The abbot stood in the middle of the great watching chamber. He gazed up at the lavishly decorated and gilded ceiling high above them. "This room has an atmosphere which is full of malignancy. What was its use? It was the first of King Henry's state apartments. It once led to his presence chamber and other more private rooms. But its actual use? Twofold. Its name derives from the yeoman guards stationed here on watch to protect the king and to control access to him by the courtiers, but it was also where the most senior courtiers ate when the court was resident. Great turbulence and great evil have been conceived here, the abbot stated simply. Turbulence, certainly, Father. It was in this room in 1541 that the court was told of Queen Catherine Howard's infidelity. Her household was dismissed there and then, Alice said. The abbot moved to the open doorway in the corner. They were finally entering the gallery. Adrian was with them. The abbot had impressed Adrian, as Simon had anticipated. "At least he's not Max von fucking Sydow," he whispered in Simon's ear. Simon sensed a change in atmosphere in the palace as soon as the abbot entered the great hall. He must surely have been imagining it, but it was as if the whole building was alerted to the abbot's presence, as if something malevolent was watching him. It felt as if a power greater than anything they'd experienced so far was concentrating all the malice it could muster on them, especially on the abbot. The feeling of menace grew stronger as they entered the gallery. The abbot, leading the way, appeared unruffled. Simon felt the hairs rise on the back of his neck. "There is a focus here, but it is not truly evil. Distressed, I would say. But there is evil all around us. Can you feel it?" the abbot asked. The three of them nodded. He gestured for them to sit at the monitoring station while he perched on a bench beneath one of the windows. Intentionally or otherwise, he had chosen to sit as close to the center of the ghost activity they had monitored as he could have. "Tell me about Queen Catherine Howard," he said, directing his question at Alice. "She was accused of adultery here in the palace by Archbishop Thomas Cranmer. Well, not accused directly, he was far too much of a snake for that. He left a letter for Henry in the royal pew outlining facts about the young queen's loose moral behavior as a girl. This is the strange fact about Catherine. She was accused of committing adultery before she was even married. Surely a high point in Tudor English family law. John Lascelles, whose sister had been in the Duchess of Norfolk's household within which Catherine had been brought up, claimed that this sister had irrefutable evidence that Catherine was not a virgin when she married the king. He stated that she had lost her virginity before the age of 14, either to her music teacher, Henry Mannix, or to Francis Derham, a gentleman pensioner. In other words, a young man of good family, but poor, who was employed by the Duke to conduct business for him at home and abroad. If it was true in either case, it would have been more likely to be Derham, who might have seen an opportunity to advance himself by seducing a niece of the Duke of Norfolk. Mannix was not of good enough family to hope even for that. Catherine would have been vulnerable, on the threshold of womanhood, no doubt impressionable, and living within a relaxed, perhaps too relaxed, dormitory atmosphere. But she was still a young girl, easy prey for a young man on the make. How old was Derham? Nobody knows, but certainly a lot older than Catherine. So why did this man Lascelles put this story forward? The abbot asked. No one knows that either, but it is likely to have been the struggle between the factions at court. The new reformers were probably behind it. Catherine's biggest problem was being a member of the preeminent Roman Catholic family in England. By dangling her in front of a frustrated and lonely king, a king who felt duped by his chancellor Thomas Cromwell into accepting a queen he couldn't love, and by succeeding in arousing the king's infamous lechery, the Duke had reversed the pecking order at court. The old religion was back on top. Power had been wrested from the new Protestant reformers, who had held sway throughout the reigns of Anne Boleyn, Jane Seymour, and Anne of Cleves. and returned to the Conservatives. All the machinations of Thomas Cromwell brought to nothing. They were back to the times of Catherine of Aragon. The Pope might have once again had an influence in England. The reformist faction would have machinated to get rid of her as soon as they recognized the king's interest. Any means would have done. Besmirching her reputation would do nicely. So Catherine was in a desperately dangerous position from the time she was made queen until she became pregnant. A year had elapsed, but there was still no sign of that. It seems likely that the king was impotent by now, though he would never have admitted as much. But why was the charge enough to cause her death? Adultery, which wasn't? The fact that she wasn't a virgin when she married Henry? Could they have killed her for that, even in those days? Henry was, by this time, a megalomaniacal, cruel and vindictive tyrant. In sullying the royal marriage bed by coming to it without her virginity, she was making a mockery of the royal union and making Henry a retrospective cuckold to boot. Kings are meant to get the first crack of the whip where sexual relationships are concerned. Coming to his marriage bed without being intact could have been seen by Henry and his council as high treason, and high treason was consistently punished by death, and they made the rules up as they went along where high treason was concerned. Actual proof was unnecessary, given the king's paranoia. They didn't even have to bring Catherine to trial. A new Act of Attainder saw to that. Just planting the seed was enough to seal her fate. Poor girl. Poor girl is right. Do you think she died a martyr for the Roman Catholic cause? Alice hesitated. No, I believe she was an unwitting political pawn and paid the penalty for her uncle's overreaching ambition. The Duke, incidentally, did nothing to save her. On the contrary, he distanced himself from her to save his own skin. And was she innocent of any wrongdoing? Therein lies an irony. I don't think she was any more fervently religious than her wretched uncle. She was probably only 17 when she died, reputedly a carefree and kind teenager, though possibly spoilt and feckless, and certainly flattered by her elevated status. And she would have been amenable to carrying out any action demanded by her family. Family loyalty was taken for granted in those days. She would have felt it her duty, especially for a family as elevated and as powerful as the Howards. But there were two factors which were looming much more ominously than the revelations which caused her arrest. The first was Francis Derham, who had reappeared from Ireland to claim his wife, maintaining that Catherine had a prenuptial contract with him. Prenuptial contracts were considered binding in Tudor law. Catherine would have committed bigamy in marrying Henry. Norfolk might have been able to quash that by denying the truth of the story and by removing him from court again. But Derham was recklessly telling this tale to anybody who would listen. If it had reached the ears of the king, that would have been curtains for Catherine and Norfolk. Why did Derham start blurting it out? The last desperate throw of an adventurer who had lost the goose which was going to lay him the golden egg, probably. Perhaps he hoped he could blackmail Catherine or Norfolk into providing him with money, or some preferment by way of lands or title, to ensure his silence. And the other factor? Well, this is the real irony, and I suspect it was the real reason Catherine was so terrified when arrested. I think it likely she really was committing adultery in a desperate attempt to become pregnant. With whom? Her distant cousin, Thomas Culpeper. Wasn't that risky beyond belief? Yes. To foist a bastard on the royal marriage and try to pass that bastard off as the king's certainly was high treason. And she took ever greater risks the more desperate she became. But I think she knew she had to become pregnant or she was done for. Her uncle was, no doubt, endlessly pointing that out in his usual abrasive way. In fact, he was possibly instrumental in machinating her adultery. The last words seemed to echo emptily in the strange, watchful, malignant atmosphere in the gallery. It seemed to respond with a noise like a sigh. Simon must have imagined that, surely. No, the abbot had heard something too, because he looked up suddenly. Alice did as well. "I think it is time we tried to put this young woman's distressed soul to rest, don't you?" He looked hard at Alice as he spoke. "Please," she said. The takeoff from Johannesburg was smooth, with little turbulence, and they were now heading north comfortably at their cruising altitude and speed. 12 hours until they were due to land at London Heathrow. Julie caught Emma's glance from the other side of the drinks trolley and nearly burst out laughing. Emma, the senior stewardess on the flight, had pointed him out earlier and whispered in her ear, "Very strange one in 14C, and he's all yours." And here they were at row 14, and she really had to struggle to control her face and voice as she asked him if he wanted anything. She managed it just by concentrating on turning on what her boyfriend described as her million-kilowatt smile. His request was given in a polite, well-modulated voice, but when she handed the drink over, her eyes met his briefly, and she almost dropped it. His look was the coldest, deadest look she'd ever seen, but that wasn't what shocked her. It was the sudden flare of hatred, rapidly extinguished, that she saw in his eyes as he appraised her. Julie wasn't used to being hated. She was used to being admired and flirted with, quite often actually in this job, being pretty, bubbly and flirtatious herself. So much for her million kilowatts. That look had scared her. She felt insulted and indignant and a little frightened. Well, sod him, she thought. She shrugged, recovered herself and passed on to the next passenger, trying to make her indignation clear purely by body language. But he'd already turned those strange eyes away. She tried to dismiss that look from her thoughts, but it stayed with her throughout the rest of the dispensing of refreshments. Back in the cramped galley, away from the eyes and ears of the passengers, Emma said, "Well, what? 14C, the strange one. What do you think?" Emma's tone was playfully humorous, and she was surprised at the indignation in Julia's reply. "Yeah, he is wearing a wig. A good one, but it's still a wig. Anyway, he's an arsehole." Emma ignored that. "Why is he wearing a wig?" "I haven't a clue. Perhaps he's bald. Men hate being bald. Or on chemo. I hope it's chemo. Only he looks too robust for that. Perhaps it's a disguise." She emphasized disguise theatrically. "Anyway, did you see the look he gave me? I was only offering him a bloody drink." "No," Emma said. "Well, it was pure hatred," Julie said. "He must be a nutter." Emma didn't like talk of nutters. It unsettled her. In her experience, she had lots, nutters were nothing but a pain in the arse on flights. She hoped fervently that this one wasn't going to be, if he was a nutter. There was something unsettling about the idea of a disguise as well. She decided not to think about it anymore. "There are plenty of weird people around," Emma said. "My old Lancastrian granny used to say, 'There's none so queer as folk.'" Julie giggled. "Humans are weird, full stop," Emma thought to herself. You learned that after doing this job for 10 years. When she was first taken on, she remembered her sense of pride at having landed such a glamorous job. She sighed inwardly. "Anyway, come on," she said more briskly than she felt. "Let's clear this trolley and start on the meal." They were busy stacking the food trays into another trolley, and Julie was still scowling with indignation when the first officer appeared from the flight deck. He squeezed behind Julie, coming unnecessarily close, putting his hands on her hips and pressing his groin hard against her bum as he slid past. She stopped scowling, stopped dwelling on the horrible man, and started dwelling on the 2-night stopover in London. They were all staying in the same hotel. The first officer was married, of course, but he was good fun. and looked as if he would be even more fun in bed, and he'd been flirting with Julie outrageously for weeks. What the hell? Perhaps she'd give in. He got whatever it was he was using as an excuse for rubbing up against Julie from his locker, and returned to the flight deck, repeating his over-familiar caress of her bottom on the way back. This time, she arched her back so her buttocks jutted back into him. He left with a broad, foolish, self-satisfied grin. Emma had seen the whole maneuver, of course, and caught the lust in Julie's eyes as they followed his departing figure, and the slight flush flooding her cheeks. Her eyes half closed with irony. "That's it, love," she said. "Take your mind off arseholes in wigs. Think about arseholes in uniforms." The abbot gestured for the three of them to seat themselves behind the bank of monitor screens in the elbow of the haunted gallery. He stood in the centre of the longer wing, near the entrance to Henry's royal pew. He produced a phial of liquid from his pocket and placed it on the floor in front of him, and then a battered prayer book, from which he began to read aloud in Latin. Simon found the cadences of the archaic language strangely comforting. Adrian nudged Simon's elbow and gestured at the temperature dials. Plummeting. They could feel it. Not freezing, but cold enough. Alice shivered. Simon felt the background menace, which had been there all along, being swamped by a different atmosphere, a strong atmosphere of sadness and despair, and it was growing. Gradually, the abbot's face became easier to see in the gloom. Something was illuminating it. Simon glanced at the infrared monitor. A huge orb on the abbot's left from their perspective, between him and the entrance to the pew, was growing in intensity. A wailing noise started, then the hysterical sobs of a female, utterly distraught, beyond calming, echoed through the gallery. A movement on the screen distracted Simon. The orb was leaving the abbot's side. It was moving towards them. A figure was forming right behind Alice, in the corner, close enough to touch her. The abbot continued to read from his prayer book as if nothing was happening. And then she was suddenly with them, clearly visible, immediately behind Alice, the buxom young woman of the recordings and Simon's dreams, but this time dressed. She wore a dark gold dress with elaborate silk sleeves and an alluringly low, square neckline. Her hair was bound up beneath a jeweled French hood, and she wore a massive necklace of rubies and pearls, from which hung the largest emerald he'd ever seen. Her image was much more intense than they had ever seen it. She looked as substantial as any of them. She looked at the abbot, then she turned and looked down at the three of them. A bewildered and frightened, bonny face. God, she was young. Then Simon's heart gave a lurch. Green eyes again. The same eyes as Rose's, the same eyes as Alice's. Beautiful, smoky green eyes. How could that be? The abbot moved finally, scooping up the phial and, still speaking in Latin, strode towards them and made the sign of the cross, with his hand in the air between himself and the ghost, directly above Alice's head. The ghostly young woman was staring at the abbot with fear. The sobbing had faded away. Now there was an ominous silence. The abbot continued praying and scattered the contents of the phial at the figure of Queen Catherine Howard. It was she, Simon felt sure. It couldn't be anyone else. Except, of course, that she had died by beheading on February the 13th in the year 1542. Simon could feel the sense of menace growing again. The figure rocked to and fro as if being tugged at by some invisible force. The shrieking began again. Beneath the prayer book the abbot had been holding, a crucifix, a simple wooden cross. He held it towards Catherine and it began to glow, faintly at first, then with increasing intensity until it was bathing them all in a bright golden light. The shrieking stopped abruptly and the ensuing quiet felt full of expectation. But the feeling of menace remained. Suddenly the ghost stepped forward, enveloping Alice. Alice gave one piercing cry. The abbot lunged forward with the crucifix until it touched the ghost on the forehead. There was a shower of sparks and the ghost seemed to glow. The abbot issued a command in Latin. The ghost seemed to bow in supplication, then it disappeared. Simon felt a definite sensation of someone leaving. In its place, there was an eerie, echoing silence. The feeling of despair had gone, but the feeling of menace was growing ever stronger. The gallery was throbbing with it. Simon reached for Alice, who was slumped over the monitor in front of her. As he touched her, he felt the strangest sensation. It was as if a tumbling torrent of icy water poured through him, flooding him, drowning him. He remembered patients who had survived strokes, describing a similar sensation. But there was something else about what he was experiencing. His last conscious thought was that it was not a torrent of water. It was more a whispering, murmuring torrent of tormented souls. We four were in the great watching chamber, the abbot, Adrian, Alice and I, waiting for something to happen. I was terrified. The sensation of being watched was intense, and so was the palpable sense of evil which surrounded us and which was growing all the time. An eerie silence was broken by the abbot speaking. "Stand still and don't be afraid," he said quietly. "Nothing can harm us if we have sufficient faith." "But I don't have any faith," I thought in panic. "Oh, Christ," moaned Adrian in my ear. "I don't have any faith at all. He's gonna poke it in the eye, isn't he?" "The other side of the fucking globe," I said. "Doc, remember?" I couldn't reply. I seemed to be dumb. I stood there, rooted to the spot, seemingly unable to move and unable to do other than the abbot's bidding. Alice was clutching me with trembling arms. Nothing seemed to be happening, but a firm thought fixed itself in my brain, and it silenced all others. We were about to be confronted by something truly evil. At the far end of the large chamber, beyond the great oriel window, from the wall that had held the entrance to King Henry's private apartments, bright blood-red light started to glow, and cloudy vapor with the consistency of fog started to roll, seemed to pour through the very fabric of the wall. The fog crept out across the floor and rolled around our feet. It was icy. A strong smell assaulted my nostrils, which I identified as that acrid volcanic ash and sulfur smell I'd encountered before. This time it was overlain by another smell, the almost sweet stink of decaying flesh, which I associated with the familiar air of the morgue, and how I imagined the air smelled from a freshly opened tomb. The abbot started to pray quietly, but the prayer was suddenly drowned out by a strident voice, which appeared to come from nowhere and filled the chamber, ringing echoes that ricocheted from the tapestried walls.
"No, not this time, I seem to know. You wretched, self-righteous, sodomizing priest. How dare you presume to send away my plaything with your puny powers? I shall bring her back, now."
From the floor, by the wall, nearest to the abbot, a column of foggy vapor rose. The abbot started to pray, loudly in Latin, but a cacophony of wails and screams drowned his words out. An indistinct figure seemed to form in the foggy column, illuminated by the blood-red glow, which was intensifying. As it formed, I could make out two human figures, and as the image became clearer, it was evident that it was a young couple making love. The young man was dressed only in a shirt which ended at bare, shapely buttocks, which were thrusting vigorously, their energy directed into the young woman's crotch. She was dressed in an undergown of material so fine that through it her full youthful breasts were clearly visible, and it was rucked up round her waist as she received the man's thrusts with obvious pleasure, pinned with her back to the wall and her legs entwined round his middle. I didn't recognize the man, though I seemed to be experiencing his sensations. But I did recognize the young woman whose face, unseeing in its ecstasy, was turned towards us. It was Catherine. The wailing, which had drowned out the abbot's voice, had turned to feminine squeals of approaching orgasm, and Catherine began to buck in the young man's arms. His arms felt like my arms, and to my horror, at the same time, and in complete synchronicity, Alice squealed and bucked in mine. I hugged her to me, but she seemed only semi-conscious. I held Alice tight while her shudders of ecstasy continued. The abbot shouted some words at the top of his voice in Latin. They sounded to be commands. There was no change in the tableau before us, and when there was, it was so faint I thought my eyes were deceiving me. The atmosphere was now dripping with malice, and the abbot's body was shaking as if he had a fever. He reached with difficulty into his pocket and drew out the wooden crucifix. As he did so, in the red glow behind the ecstatic couple, a pit of darkness seemed to be forming, a space so impenetrably dark that it had an entity all of its own. From it radiated evil, great waves of sorrow, the despair of death, the silence of the tomb, the rotting smell of decomposition, and in its depth I imagined I could see a terrifying figure starting to form. So faint against the inky blackness I couldn't be sure. Something or somebody immensely powerful was approaching fast, coming straight at us. The abbot started to shake so violently I thought he would drop the crucifix, but he didn't. Instead, he yelled out something and hurled it straight at the center of the blackness. There was a blinding flash and a colossal burst of sound, a simultaneous bass roar and high-pitched shrieking, which echoed round and round in my head. And then there was only profound silence and total darkness. I was walking through a rose garden, the scent of the abundant blooms powerful and heady, on a beautiful sunny day. I could hear the tinkling laughter behind a tall clipped hedgerow, and rounding the corner, found myself among a group of new young ladies of the court, their patron, the young Queen Catherine, at their centre. My arrival caused giggling of a more self-conscious, flirtatious sort, but they parted in a friendly fashion to allow me access to the Queen. They all looked very glamorous in their court dresses, but none were as glamorous or pretty as Catherine herself. "Ah, Thomas, come here. Would you walk with us? We're taking the air in this glorious sunshine, aren't we, ladies?" And she came forward and tucked her arm in mine, striding off so that we led a small procession as her ladies followed. We strolled through the Privy Gardens. "Well met, dear coz, but I'm cross with you. You've not been near us for days." "I suspect you've been finding comfort in another woman's arms," said Catherine. "I've had little choice. Your husband has been ever present, jealously guarding his little jewel from the attentions of her friends." "Yes, well, it's only the attention of one friend I have needed, and that friend has been neglectful." She pouted. I ignored the unjust accusation and smiled at her. She tried not to smile back, but she failed. Her eyes twinkled. "You are the naughtiest and the cruelest man I know, Thomas Culpepper." We walked on in amiable silence while I strove to cope with the feeling of her warm breast against my arm and the playful nudge of her hip against mine. It was night. I was reading by the fire. My servant bid me attend a summons. He would lead me there. We were in Pontefract Castle. She and Henry were on their progress through the north of the realm, and many of us were with them. It was a balmy night, but, thank God, not a starry or moonlit one. At the base of a fortified tower, my servant came to a stout and narrow door, which was ajar. Ascend the stairs to the first chamber. He would guard this doorway, which was my only way back, were his laconic instructions. The further I rose, the further my heart sank. I guessed what reception I would receive, for I had weakened and lain with a very pretty lady of her court. Catherine Tilney had flirted with me, making her availability for sexual dalliance evident. Her husband was away from court. I had responded. When I reached the solar, there were just two people there, Catherine and my Lady Rochford. The room was L-shaped, and Lady Rochford retired round the corner to sit by the fire. Catherine was meek and quiet at first, but not for long. "Nearly a fortnight since I saw you last, Thomas, and how do you repay my misfortune? I wonder how you can so dissemble in telling me you love me so while taking so little time to lie with another. Catherine, you were married to the king before I loved the other. You know Dorothy Bray, who has Sir William Parr?" "Yes, Dorothy Bray, a colleague when you and she were maids of Anne of Cleves." "Well, if she can have Sir William, I could, if I wish, have you." "Catherine, shame on you. You're no Dorothy Bray." "Well, if I had still been in the maiden's chamber, I would have tried you, Thomas. I love you." Her voice was wheedling. "And you say you love me, do you?" She was becoming agitated and close to tears. She kept coming towards me, then pulling away, casting nervous glances over her shoulder towards the door and Lady Rochester. "Oh, Thomas, this is so dangerous. I don't know what to do. We should stop this, but I can't." I crept to the corner. Lady Rochester was asleep or feigning sleep. I pulled Catherine into the furthest corner away from the door and the fireplace and took her in my arms. I felt her all along my length, hot and tremulous. I kissed her and her lips parted and our tongues explored longingly. Then I pushed her away. "Catherine, sweetheart, I do love you, but this is too dangerous. I must leave. I dare not presume what my body presumes already." She said nothing and half reached for me again, but she let me go. The note in Catherine's handwriting read, "As ye find the door, so to come." It was in York, one night, some days later, that the possibility arose. I came and found her in a teasing mood. There was no Lady Rochford. She was in the next room, and Catherine had locked the intervening door. She was dressed still in her sumptuous gown, but she had removed her headdress and let down her hair. The dark blonde hair rippled down her back to her waist, glinting in the candlelight. "Ah, Thomas, I wondered who it would be, for I have scores of lovers by other doors as well as you." "I don't doubt it," I replied in similar tone, but I grabbed her and pulled her to me. I kissed her gently and then with increasing fervour. She was so beautiful. She was unlacing my codpiece. "God help us, Thomas," she whispered in my ear. "This is madness, but please help me to have a baby, Thomas, or I am dead." I pulled away from her slightly so I could see her face, shock making mine rigid. "Catherine, the king doesn't?" "He can't, Thomas. He doesn't know it because I pretend, but he doesn't spill seed, truly. And without giving him another heir, I'm dead. But he cannot possibly be ignorant of his lack of spilling." I was shocked and alarmed. "Oh, Thomas, he's a self-deluder. He is king, so he believes all things are possible. He has made himself God's representative on earth, and he has made himself truly believe it. So, and he believes this too, he can make me conceive by immaculate conception, just by clicking his fingers." Her tone became speculative. "He is mad, truly." She was stroking me distractedly. My mind was being torn in two. She was my flirtatious young cousin, with a body and inclination for swiving, But she was also the Queen to the King of England. Then again, she was desperate. If she didn't become pregnant, it didn't bear thinking about. I could feel myself weakening. Yes, but we know it takes something more, don't we, sweet coz? Come here. We were sitting together on the chest, caressing each other more calmly. She became serious. Don't ever shrive yourself of these happenings between us, Thomas, in the confessional, will you? For the king, being supreme head of the church, would be sure to have knowledge of it. I protested that I never would. A shiver ran down my spine at the realization of the danger we put ourselves in. If the king ever found out. Yet it didn't stop us. We continued to whisper recklessly of our love for each other, and continued to caress each other. She shivered all the time, whether by passion or fear I knew not. It was madness, but a wonderful madness. Then there was a hammering at the door. Terror clutched us both, and we froze. "Make haste, someone comes," hissed Lady Rochford on the other side of the door. I sprang up, lacing my codpiece as well as I could. Catherine pushed me towards the door to the back staircase. "Lock this door behind me, unlock the other, and go to your prayers," I suggested, indicating the prie-dieu in the corner. "And be careful, sweetheart." I stole a last yearning kiss. I heard the bolt slide across behind me. I paused an instant. No one on the stairs. I went down them rapidly and silently, and had just reached the outer door when it was flung aside brutally, hiding me behind it in the process. And two figures leapt for the stairs. When they started hammering at the door at the top, I slipped silently out. "Psst!" My page hissed from the deep shadows behind the tower wall. I joined him. "Did they see you?" "Nah," he said with contempt. "In too much of a hurry, but I'm surprised they didn't get you. I was lucky. Now let's get away from here." We melted into the deepest shadows and made a cautious and circuitous way back to our lodgings and safely to our beds. I didn't sleep. I relived over and over my assignation with the Queen. We had had a close escape, so close that my body still trembled with fright. It occurred to me to wonder who was suspicious enough to send soldiers to the only two entrances to the Queen's temporary lodgings. I thought as well about her plea to make her pregnant. Lust and terror battled within me all night. Just before dawn, I resolved to persist despite the dangers. If Catherine could become pregnant, we were all secure. Ambition brought me a certain calm. I took a draught of small beer to drown my final thought. It would, of course, be high treason. I could hear voices. They came to me suddenly, invading my thoughts. One was male, and one female. The female voice sounded concerned and seemed to come from somewhere to my side. The male one was authoritative, yet benign. It came from somewhere else, I knew not where. I recognized neither of them. They spoke strangely, and kept repeating a name I couldn't quite hear. It might have been Simon. I was not in the habit of hearing voices, yet they were not disturbing. On the contrary, I found them comforting, for, despite their evident urgency, they imbued a feeling of warmth and comfort, which was miraculous given my current circumstances, for I was utterly undone. When they arrested me, we, by that I mean my Lord King Henry and several others of us, all his favourites, were hunting in the park. More accurately, out a-hawking. Starting as a quiet noise and growing rapidly, we could hear the sound of many hooves riding at speed. Whoever they were heading in our direction and would rapidly overhaul us. Unusually, the king appeared or pretended not to notice, but the sudden sly glance he couldn't prevent himself from giving me turned my blood to ice and my bowels to water. A large troop of his guard burst through the trees and rapidly separated me from the rest of our party by barging my horse, terrifying it and my falcon in the process. It was all I could do to retain my seat as I attempted to calm my rearing horse and settle the falcon, which was trying desperately to escape its jesses. I tried to shout out in protest, but no words came. The look on my lord's face, who had turned his horse to face the scene, dried my spittle. It was a look of hatred and contempt. "Take him to the tower," was all he said, in that high wheedling tone which came so incongruously from such a massive bulk. He immediately wheeled his horse and rode away, my companions turning to follow, all avoiding my gaze as they did so. Their faces showed a range of emotions as they left. Some showed frank relief, many looked solemn, but none showed any regret. Sir Thomas Risley, Secretary of the King's Council, was no friend of mine. He had long resented my influence with the King and the protection it afforded me. His face was full of self-satisfaction now, though, and that was worrying, as was his sneering, careless attitude. He was pursuing a strange and worrying line of questioning about my meetings with Catherine. Even more worryingly, he kept referring to her as Mistress Howard, not Her Majesty or Queen Catherine. Only a fool would not realize that someone had spoken. Someone had betrayed us. But who? And what of Catherine? Had she been arrested? Had she spoken? She would have had to be broken before doing so. They would not have put her to the torture, surely. But the way this bastard's weasel eyes kept sliding to the floor, I knew it was only a matter of time before I was put to that test myself. Beneath the floor was the chamber containing items of correction. He was looking forward to it. His eyes said so. I was strapped on my back to a hurdle by my hands and feet. It was being pulled roughly across the cobbles by a horse, which was being switched at regular intervals, designed, no doubt, to enhance the discomfort of the ride. People howled, shrieked, and spat upon me from all sides, but that was as nothing compared to the intolerable pain in my hands and feet. I raised my head and looked at my feet, unrecognizable. Both were a mangled mess of blue and red. That bastard Risley had tortured me, of course. It gave him such obvious pleasure he virtually swooned, until I managed to collect enough of a dottle of spittle in my dry mouth to get him straight in the eye. He wanted an admission of adultery with the Queen. I had denied adultery. I had, when I could take no more pain, admitted the intention of committing the act with Catherine, but insisted it had never happened, a white lie I stupidly thought might save us. The intention had been more than enough for him. If he had known the reality, it would have made no difference, I now recognized, except that I could have given voice to my genuine love for my little cousin. I would not have denied her. What, I thought, had she herself admitted or denied? That very first time in her privy, when we were so driven by lust that restraint disappeared, and we swived with the skirts of her finest gown rucked up around her waist, and her court jewellery clinking and rattling with my thrusts, and she bit into the shoulder of my jerkin so hard, to stop herself screaming, that she left a bite mark in it forever. Or on my knee in the alcove of the window of her state room, our activity concealed by her skirts. Or that one night, deliciously in her very bed, where we lay blissfully naked in each other's arms afterwards, until the King's messenger, Denny, tried to gain entrance to warn of the King's intention to visit. He furtively rattled the locked door, called Catherine's name once quietly, and then left. If the King himself had tried the door unannounced and found his way barred. The cobbles gave way to an earth track with open fields on either side. They were taking me to Tyburn. We arrived. The ties on my hands and feet were roughly loosened, and they dragged me by my arms up the steps of the scaffold. I was pulled upright and lashed to the base of the gallows, as my feet would not hold my weight, facing the scene in front of me. There were several men in hoods on the platform, with a large butcher's block and a lit brazier. Derham was there already, my co-adulterer, gibbering between two of the men in hoods, who held him upright, facing the baying crowd below. It was a large crowd. Many had come to see us die. Derham would suffer a worse death, He had no exalted family connections, and he had been boastful of his previous relationship with Catherine. They had clearly been waiting for my appearance before starting, because now they began to assault Derham violently. Even though he was bound hand and foot, he stood no chance. While the two continued to hold him upright, a third headbutted him, smashing his nose and causing blood to pour down his face. They tore his clothes from him until he was stark naked. A noose was put round his neck, and yanking on the rope, they pulled him up on the gallows until his feet just left the ground. They hanged him like this and watched as he spasmed and jerked and gasped for air in a macabre dance which seemed to go on for minutes, until the movements weakened, his face turned mottled blue, and his tongue lolled purple from his mouth. He stopped moving altogether. Immediately the executioners lowered him to the ground, just. He was still suspended, his feet barely touching the ground. He tried to stand. He gagged for air. They loosened the noose slightly. One of them approached him with a wicked-looking knife with a thin, curved blade. He groaned, choked, and then started screaming hideously as the knife wielder cut off his genitals. Blood fountained from his groin. The executioner held the pathetic handful of penis and scrotum aloft so that the crowd could see, and then rammed them into Derham's screaming mouth. The screaming stopped immediately and Derham collapsed, knees sagging, now held up once more by the noose round his neck alone. The same man with the knife now sliced open his belly with one huge cut from ribs to groin vertically, and his bowels tumbled out like an obscene mass of eels and lay about his feet. They picked up the mass and flung it, still connected to the body, into the burning brazier next to him. The sound and smell of the burning bowels were so revolting that the crowd fell silent. Derham did not react. If not already dead, he was beyond feeling. They emptied the abdominal cavity and added the organs to the disgusting fire. They cut down the body and threw it onto the large butcher's block on its back. They hacked off the head with one splintering blow through the neck from the front, and then hacked the body crudely into 4 sections, 2 arms, each with half of the chest attached, and 2 legs, each with half a pelvis. They then plucked from the gore the 4 body parts and the head, and holding one part each aloft, they faced the crowd gleefully, proud of their dexterous butchery of a recently vibrant young man. An innocent young man. They were met with a sullen silence. Even this crowd of lumpen ignorance, who had been baying with collective bloodlust a few moments ago, had reached satiation. Now the crowd were just frightened, for the man's soul and at the grim reminder of this king's boundless ferocity. The executioners threw the head and body parts into a wooden box. Then they turned to me. There was a moan from the crowd. They untied me and dragged me to the block. They let me kneel in front of it. The fear was intolerable. Just let me hold on to my bowels for the sake of dignity. I refused the blindfold. Oh, bless you, my love, Catherine, may your end be as swift, and then you can be free of the vindictive old monster too. Maybe we'll meet in paradise. I'll wait for you. I truly loved you. That was the irony. Did you know? I know you did. We used to fight all the time before you became queen, but when your uncle persuaded you to go to it with me, did he know how little persuasion was necessary on either side? And the more we did it, the deeper in love we fell. You don't deserve to die. I have been guilty of much wickedness, but you, nothing. Other guilty parties should be dying, though. Where is your sainted uncle, the pimp? Why is he not joining me in this macabre theatre? He who dangled your sweet person in front of the king. When is he going to get his just deserts? They say he has washed his hands of you, left the court, pleading gout. Actually, I heard that he yelled out in public that you deserved to be burnt. A truly wonderful uncle. Shall we wait together in purgatory for him and make sure he goes to hell, where he really will burn? They have asked if I wish to say anything. I shall say nothing, but I shall silently curse these sadists and their evil master. Forgiveness? Never. I played the game to reach as high as I possibly could for my own ends. I knew how to make myself popular with all the men and women, all the way up to the king. But what I did with you, I did out of love. Isn't that strange? I looked at the disgusting, gore-encrusted block of filthy wood, with its quarter-sphere divot for the chin, and the scars of the axe blows, and the traces of sharded bone and bloody tissue left behind. I lowered my head and stretched my neck onto the slimy surface, my chin in the hollow, and stretched out my arms. Let the bastards finish it. The crowd grew silent. I heard a soft whooshing noise, discerned a disturbance in the air, close to me. There was a flash of excruciating and intolerable pain, the thump of an axe head biting into wood, a sound like drumming feet, a sensation of toppling, then nothing. I awoke, or did I? I dreamt I became aware then. I opened my eyes. At least I thought I was conscious, and that I had opened my eyes. It made no difference. My retina encountered the same profound darkness, open or closed. Either there was no light at all where I was, or I had become suddenly completely blind. I was lying on some hard surface with minimal cushioning. I tried moving. I could move my arms, but within a short distance they encountered something solid with silk lining. To the sides and above, the same. There was not enough space to stretch my arms above my head. I tried moving my legs. Worse, less space still. I could part my legs a couple of inches at the most. Bending my knees, the same. I was in a very constricting box, flat on my back, with my arms folded across my chest. It was stifling. There was no air whatsoever. I tried shouting. It sounded loud in the box, but with deeply muffled quality. There was immediate and total silence as soon as I stopped. I unfolded my arms as far as I could, which brought my hands, with some effort, directly above my face. I checked that my head was connected to my neck. I had no idea why. And then I pushed at the hard surface above me. Nothing. No give at all. I tried thumping it, farcically given the lack of space to move. It sounded as if there was a ton of earth on top of it anyway. It wasn't a box. It was an upholstered box, a buried, upholstered box. It wasn't a box at all. It was a coffin. I tried to hold on to my reason, but I felt myself being engulfed by terror. Usually when I dreamt, a crisis like this would have woken me up. That didn't happen on this occasion. It was as if I drowned in my terror and lost consciousness again for a while, because my next conscious experience was somebody trying to rouse me. I could hear her calling my name repeatedly. Simon, 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 and I knew her voice too. She stood in front of me, calling my name impatiently, her familiar figure, her face as I remembered it, animated with urgency. Rosie, my dead wife, whose life had been snuffed out by cancer, whose ashes I had poured out over St. Aldom's head, was now wrenching the heavy oak lid off the buried coffin, the wooden lid giving way with great splintering shrieks, shrugging aside tons of earth as if it was smoke, grabbing me and dragging me upright, out of my tomb and into fresh, blissfully fresh, clean, untainted air. My lungs expanded until I thought they would burst with my hunger for air. I went on sucking in huge lungfuls as if I had been drowning, and then she hugged me to her. She felt warm, alive warm, and she whispered in my ear, in her seductive Boston accent, "You've got to fight, Simon. You have enemies much closer than you would ever imagine. You have to fight them, Simon, and you have to win for all our sakes. Simon, do you hear me? You must go back. You must not come to me. I love you, but you've got to go back and live to defeat them, Simon. And Alice needs you. She is in great danger, and you're the only one who can save her, with the abbot's help. Go back to them now. Leave me. Help the abbot destroy this evil. But be careful, Simon. She clasped me to her and kissed me as if she was saying farewell. And I kissed her back, a kiss full of yearning and loss. He woke abruptly to find himself kissing a woman full on the lips. Her body felt warm, even voluptuous, as she wriggled in his clasping arms, definitely alive. He opened his eyes to see very large, dark brown, indignant eyes blazing back at him from very close range. When she recovered from the shock, freed herself from his arms, and thrust him back onto the bed, he was confronted with the vision of a flushed and flustered Mandy, quivering with indignation, and trying, rather fetchingly some part of him thought, to rearrange her sister's cap, which had obviously become dislodged in his unwelcome embrace. "Dr. Carlyle!" Her voice rang out with such theatrical outrage that he could hear the running footsteps in the hospital corridor outside almost immediately, even before he could think straight. "'S all right, Mandy," he said. "Cavalry's on his way." Oh, he was definitely back in the land of the living. "He is coming back to us." The Italian accented English penetrated the nothingness in his head. Was he? He thought he'd died. He had felt the axe, felt his head coming off, felt the sensation of it toppling to the straw. No, wait, not him. That was someone else. He couldn't remember whom. Hang on, he did remember. Thomas Culpepper. He felt a sudden surge of sexual arousal. He'd made love to a queen, Catherine Howard. They'd been good at it. And he had dreamt he was Thomas Culpepper being executed. Then he had just dreamed that he had been hauled out of a coffin by Rose's ghost. So this was he, alive somehow, awakened from some nightmare? What had they been doing before that, though? There'd been a bigger nightmare still, hadn't there? Something too big, too powerful. He felt his grip on reality loosening again. He felt he was being pulled back again by a young woman. He felt it was Catherine. God, this was like being poisoned by mescaline. And there was a struggle going on inside him, two minds fighting for control. And what had been that massive, evil entity, that thing that had been too powerful? "Come on, Simon," a clipped, educated English voice. "Can't have you joining the ghosts. Living with too many already, hmm?" Simon stared, bewildered at the apparition as it stretched out its arm to help him up. A young officer, a captain from the Royal Welch, according to the badges on his epaulettes, with blood-stained tunic and filthy puttees mixed in the stinking mud they were all wading through, with a pistol in his other hand. Simon was lying wallowing on his back in the muck at the bottom of the trench, next to a severed arm, with an untidy bloody stump still wearing the sleeve of its tunic. The muck stank of blood and shit and urine. The air stank of cordite. The young man's eyes, pale, very blue, looked with concern into Simon's as he hauled him into a sitting position. His face seemed familiar, a broken nose giving it a slightly battered look. He seemed totally disconnected from the mayhem around them, careless of the snarl of machine guns, the endless crump of heavy shells, and the mud and blood flying everywhere. Simon suddenly recognized who the young captain was. It was Robert Graves. Suddenly he felt himself being pulled away. Consciousness broke through his dream. He opened his eyes. There was the abbot by his side, and there was Prof, too. Both looked concerned and relieved. He looked around, taking in the familiar hospital room. No Robert Graves, but he was back at St. Thomas's. "How is she?" he asked. "How is Alice?"